Welcome, everyone. I just want to make a short announcement about the um, calendar out at the website for the Buddhist Center. Um, that there was going to be a class next Monday because I was supposed to be traveling today, and then we would have had the last class next Monday. But we changed that when my travel plans changed, and so tonight is the last class of this module, and I think we've removed now the class for next. Oh, Lou is going to remove it when he gets home. But just so you know, this is the final class of this module, and Discovering Buddhism will resume in the new year. So, oh, you know what I did? I forgot to open up my files. I was in here earlier doing all this wonderful work, and for some reason, I just completely forgot that. It's only take a minute. Um, I'll just adjust them when they come up. Prayers for the teachings, and we're going to recite the Heart Sutra, as usual. We talked a little bit about the Heart Sutra last week, not in a great detail, um, talking about the two truths as they're embodied in that one line. Form is empty, emptiness is form. But as we go through the recitation of the Heart Sutra, try to make it into a meditation on emptiness to the best of your ability. I think that's a perfect size. Okay, let me pull that up then on Zoom. Great. So there is that one line that usually precedes this, Om, I prostrate to the Arya triple gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on Masavultra's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Dayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Soha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya, Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. And we'll do the short mandala offering. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. Then taking refuge and generating bodhicitta 3 times, the first in English and then twice in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened, to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chenyen Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shog Sangye Chodang Soki Choknam La Jangchu Bardu Dakni Kyabsu Chi Daki Chenyen Gipe Sanam Gi Dola Penchir Sangye Drupar Shok. All right, let's do a short meditation and just give ourselves a chance to focus the mind a bit by using the breath as our meditation object. Again, this was something we discussed early on in this module, developing our concentration through single-pointed attention to an object such as the breath. We'll do that in silence for a few minutes, and then I'll come in and we'll set our motivation together. So I'll ring the bell here in the Gompa to start the meditation. Now let's set our motivation for tonight. And although we'll be talking about this more tonight in terms of uniting wisdom and compassion, I think we can already experiment with this in setting our motivation tonight. We're cultivating this mind of bodhicitta that is observing all sentient beings and wishing to become enlightened for their sake. And in this module, we've understood why sentient beings are not yet enlightened, why it's important that we dedicate ourselves to helping them on that path of awakening. Because all of the difficulties, all the suffering, all of our unenlightened existence is rooted in the ignorance that clings to fiction, clings to things existing in a way that is contrary to how they actually exist. If it wasn't for this mistake, we ourselves and all beings would not be in the situation we are in. So when we observe sentient beings, we try to do so within the understanding of that error that they are making, just like we are continuing to make that error. Moreover, we have at least met with the teachings that help us to know how to overcome that error, such as what we've examined in this module. Learning to really see how things actually exist and to undermine that ignorance that is clinging to things existing independently, inherently, intrinsically. So again, I mentioned this before, that there's a certain level of responsibility that comes with this knowledge because we have met with the perfect teachings of the Buddha that give us the exact antidote to not only end our own suffering, but to end that of all beings. We must be dedicated to their welfare. We must use this opportunity and what we have met with in terms of the Dharma for the greatest possible good. With the wish, the aspiration that we be able to help all sentient beings to not just attain a good rebirth and even not just attain their own liberation, but moreover to attain a state of full awakening, complete Buddhahood. Helping them to accomplish that through removing this ignorance, as well as engaging in all the other practices. And then the secondary recognition that to do that perfectly, we have to become Buddhas ourselves. Therefore, we're going to use this time we have together tonight in this final class as a means of helping us to accomplish that goal, with that motivation of benefiting all beings through having fully awakened our own minds, developed our own potential. Okay, good. All right, so in the last class, we were looking at this whole idea of the two truths and kind of this concept of how things can be classified into two different ways of kind of observing things. This is something I wanted to emphasize a little bit more at the end, and I didn't have time for, so I want to start with that tonight. We're going to kind of continue with the two truths just a little bit, and I'm going to share another example, because the important thing to understand about the two truths in the way Tsongkhapa presents them is we're not saying they have kind of absolute equality in terms of what they represent, obviously, because conventional truth has kind of been there and we can establish it through our worldly renown and what have you. Ultimate truth obviously takes greater effort to discern. We can know the things in our world much more easily. Of course, we don't really understand exactly how they exist, even though we can name them and identify them. But to get to ultimate truth obviously takes much greater effort. So we're not saying that they're kind of absolutely equal in all ways, but Tsongkhapa gives equal attention to both of them in terms of we need conventional truth as the basis upon which we engage in all the various aspects of the path. Just in, for example, setting our motivation tonight. We need to have everything that informs our bodhicitta, an awareness of how sentient beings are suffering. The tree of samsara, as I've shown you a couple of times, all of the processes by which we and other beings are still trapped in samsara and still unenlightened. And then we, of course, learn all the practices that are in the Lam Rim, in the modules of discovering Buddhism prior to this, learning about death and rebirth and the spiritual friend, the guru, learning about karma, refuge, samsara and nirvana, all these various topics, even bodhicitta, and lojong, transforming our problems. Okay, you've had all of these various teachings. Those need to be equally valued because they are the means by which we are kind of putting the fuel in the tank and moving along in the direction of it towards enlightenment. But we need the ultimate truth as well. We need to understand in the end how things don't have any independent existence so that we can remove the ignorance that clings to the opposite, that is convinced that things exist intrinsically, inherently, and so on. So what's important about these two truths that I want to emphasize at the beginning of tonight, and then we'll see if there are any questions on them after I've done this little extra presentation on that tonight, is we have to get at the fact that both of them are established by some form of what we call valid cognition. This term valid cognition, you should have run across it way back in at least module 1 of Discovering Buddhism. When we talk about the mind and the way that the mind knows. Not everything that the mind knows is necessarily without any error or mistake, but we can still be valid in regard to determining this is this, that is that, which we do once more in terms of our conventional nomenclature and our way of designating things in line with worldly renown. So there's nothing kind of mistaken about that mind other than the fact that things are not appearing in the way that they exist. Remember, we have this idea that all of the conventional phenomena have a false appearance. Of course, even emptiness has a false appearance to us until we have a direct realization of it. Everything that appears to your five senses, everything that appears to your mental consciousness is appearing in error. Remember the dream example, like things in our dream all appear to be as real as the objects in our waking life. But our waking life comes to have a greater status because when we come to, we wake up from our dream, we see that the dream objects do not appear in that way at all. It's a similar thing in regard to how everything is appearing to us all the time, to our senses again, and to our mental consciousness, as if things were self-established, as if they had their own identity, as if they existed independently, able to set themselves up. Again, it's important that we find what works for us to get at that false appearance. But nonetheless, our conventional awareness can still say, this is a table, this is a chair, this is a person, this is, whatever. All the various phenomena that are designated in line with, again, conventional agreement, those things can be posited validly by this somewhat mistaken mind, this mind that does have a false appearance. So we're never really completely throwing that out and saying, conventional truth is to be completely ignored because there's always some element of falsity to it. Because it is true. Everything that we establish is together with this mind of ignorance. Remember that three-step process that Rinpoche emphasizes. Something appears to us as a base and we learn the designation for it conceptually or verbally, or, through, again, giving names, designations to objects. The second step is it immediately appears back to us as if it was real. And the third step is that we, through a force of our ignorance, cling to that appearance as if it were real. And so, in a sense, we can say everything that is established through our conventional awareness is established with some level of falsity. Our minds that are establishing the world are not knowing things correctly. They are not knowing emptiness. Again, that's a different valid cognition. That's why, again, we have these two truths, and I didn't really have time to get into this last week. We can say, how are they posited in the end? They're posited through valid cognition, but two different valid cognizers. One that is simply looking to determine this is this, that is that, establish things in our world, whereas the valid cognizer or cognition for emptiness to get at ultimate truth is one that is seeking something deeper. How do things actually exist? Kind of getting at what they call their ontological status. How is it that a chair exists, or a table exists, or a wrist mala exists, or whatever, a clothespin, my clothespin that I brought in to demonstrate dependent arising. We're getting at kind of a deeper investigation. Whereas conventional designation is simply us deciding, oh, that's going to be a chair. And then we, come up with something that meets our idea of a chair, our definition of a chair, that fits the bill for a chair, and that we designate as chair. But again, it immediately appears to have its own chairness, to be established on its own out there. So again, for conventional truths, they're validly established, but there's some level of error, some mistake in mind in terms of them appearing falsely back to us. For ultimate truth, we have a valid cognition that can be initially conceptual. Without a doubt, we will know emptiness conceptually. That's what we've been working on in this module, is trying to get our heads around what is it that we're talking about with emptiness. Through these investigations of dependent arising and the 4-point analysis, we come to understand and taste to some degree what we mean by that term emptiness, by that idea emptiness. So we get kind of a conceptual idea of it initially. But as I've mentioned previously, initially or at some point, you're going to have a much deeper experience of emptiness. And we'll all get there eventually. May not be there yet. But when you develop your meditative stabilization, concentration, and the depth of your penetrating wisdom, and what we call the union of calm abiding and special insight, you then have a platform for not only being able to see things conceptually, which you will continue to do to some degree, but then to eventually enter into a non-conceptual awareness. And when you know emptiness through that non-conceptual awareness and what we call a direct realization, then you have an experience of emptiness exactly how it is, without any of the conceptual overlay. And you have come to know ultimate truth in its most, vivid and poignant way, an important way. Until we get to that place where we actually realize emptiness in that experience, we don't really have the full taste of it. We don't really have a full understanding. But everything we are doing to get there is extremely important. All the time we spend, and we're going to get into this a little bit later tonight, in terms of the advice from this module about how we work with these teachings in our daily life, to try to keep that kind of awareness of emptiness very fresh so that we can eventually get to that point, keep it evolving and moving. All right. So going back to this idea of the two truths being established by two different valid cognitions, two different ways of approaching things. One is, again, just looking very superficially, conventional truths, this is this, that is that. The other one is saying, but how do those conventional truths exist? And remember that we have a conventional truth and an ultimate truth kind of lined up with everything that exists, the chair and the emptiness of the chair, the table and the emptiness of the table, dawn and the emptiness of dawn. All of these things coexist. And I used that phrase last week that Guy Newland uses in his book on the two truths, inextricably bound up with each other. You can conceptually look at it and say, oh, over here is the emptiness of dawn and there's dawn, but they're bound up together. And one actually points to the other. Because you have dawn as a dependent arising, you have the lack of an independent dawn. Dawn does not exist independently. Emptiness of dawn and dawn coexist. And they always will, and they always have. We just have to come to understand that, to know that. So let me share with you a little bit from the book I read a little bit from last week as well, Introduction to Emptiness in Tsongkhapa's, as taught in Tsongkhapa's great treatise on the stages of the path. This is page 40 of this. He starts off, he says, Tsongkhapa gives a simple analogy that has helped me immensely, Guy Newland says. He says, we do not see sounds no matter how carefully we look, but this does not refute them. Right? If we talk about our visual consciousness is cued into what we call visual form, which is essentially color and shape. We can say that our eyes see chair and table and what have you because we come to know those particular shapes and colors and things that are assembled in that way. But essentially, everything that is appearing to our visual consciousness is visual form, is shape and color that then is known by that eye consciousness. The eye consciousness cannot see sound. I know there's this concept of, is it synesthesia? Where people see the color of music or something like that. I don't know, where they feel like there's kind of crossovers of what the senses are detecting, but I don't know enough about that phenomenon to be able to speak to it. In general, in Buddhism, we say that the eye consciousness is empowered to visual objects, visual form, whereas the ear consciousness is empowered to sound. Because my eye consciousness cannot know sound, Guy Newland is saying, doesn't refute sound, right? So if we talk about these two consciousnesses, one valid cognition that is knowing conventional truth, another valid cognition that is knowing ultimate truth, by my not being able to know conventional truth through my ultimate valid cognition doesn't negate conventional truth, right? Conventional truth is known validly through our conventional awarenesses that, again, establish this is this, that is that. He's getting at the fact that, again, we have two different valid approaches. One is seeing things at, again, a more superficial level. One is seeing them at a deeper level, a more ultimate level. They don't negate each other. They don't both get at the absolute, like the complete picture. They don't have the whole picture or the whole array of things that are existing, but neither do our senses, right? That was his whole point. Is like my ear sense power or my ear consciousness is not knowing visual form. It's not knowing tangible objects. It's not knowing smells or tastes, right? But that doesn't invalidate those objects. Those are known by their respective valid cognition. My tongue consciousness, taste consciousness, that then will know tastes. But again, it won't know the sounds that the ear consciousness knows. Anyway, I might be belaboring this. But let me give you the example that he uses, which I find really quite clever, that he uses when he teaches this in some of his university courses. I think he teaches up in Michigan. I don't remember what university. He says, thinking about Tsongkhapa's analogy, we never see sounds, but this does not refute them. I concocted for my students the analogy of two radio stations. Channel A is All Things Considered radio. This is our regular conventional channel. And on it, we get all kinds of information about the diversity and complexity of the world, right? Perhaps today they're airing a fierce debate. The proponents of red cars are angry in a raging controversy with the proponents of blue cars. Normally, we listen only to this station, so we take it all at face value and without deeper scrutiny. We are unaware that there is or could be any other channel. But in fact, there is a second station broadcast on Channel B. The ultimate perspective. Channel B's programming is all emptiness all the time radio. So we have All Things Considered over here, and we have all emptiness radio, So these two different channels. Every phenomenon on Channel B is presented only from the point of view of its ultimate nature. But when we tune into this channel, all of the detailed information from the other channel is unavailable. From the perspective of ultimate reality, red cars and blue cars are equally and exclusively empty, right? Because all phenomena are empty of inherent existence. The emptiness that is established for any one of them is indistinguishable from any other emptiness, because they are all a lack, a negation of independent existence, inherent existence. Guy Newland continues, he says, Channel B, Emptiness Radio, adds new information and a deeper perspective on what is being discussed on the conventional channel, Channel A. It shows that the things discussed on Channel A definitely do not exist in the way that they are ordinarily presented. When we come back to Channel A after tuning into Channel B, we now understand just how it is that Channel A is merely conventional. It is not the only or final perspective. But this new information does not, of course, prove that red cars are in all ways identical to blue cars, right? Because they might be identical in their emptiness, but it doesn't say anything about the conventional features of a red or a blue car, right? We still have to make distinctions, he said, and make choices about what, if anything, to drive. Channel B alone does not allow us to make practical distinctions. So we still need the information from channel A. I really like his use of this because I think it gets into the valuing of both of these. I may have mentioned this last week, perhaps before. I think I did last week when Tsongkhapa, Lama Tsongkhapa, again, one of these three main figures that we've been touching on here and there, and um, that even was mentioned by Guy Newland. When Tsongkhapa was really struggling with getting at the correct view of emptiness, his guru appeared to him in the form of Manjushri, that Buddha with the sword above his head, who's behind me on that side. He appeared in this form, and the advice that he gave him was two words: value conventionalities, value conventional truths. That things need to be valued on that side of the equation. You can't just throw them all out because ultimate truth says they don't exist in the way they appear, right? They still exist to some degree. We saw that through the reasoning of dependent arising, right? That things over here that are conventional truths in the end exist in a very, very slight way. Yes, dependent upon causes and conditions, dependent upon parts, and dependent upon mere imputation. But all of that is mere imputation, merely imputed causes and conditions that give rise to a merely imputed effect, and the merely imputed parts that give rise to a merely imputed whole. All of these things have a very, very subtle way of existing, but they exist and can be validly known. And why I'm just again emphasizing this is because that this whole thing helps you in correct understanding of the two truths, how they are posited, what they are referring to, how they both are pointing to some level of reality, if you will. That's the middle way. That's what we are trying to find, is a way where we can uphold emptiness, because emptiness will keep us from falling into the extreme of grasping at things as if they had that independent intrinsic existence. And yet we can posit them still arising, still being dependent upon factors and coming into existence. That keeps us from falling into that nihilistic bent, that extreme of non-existence. So this is the importance of the two truths, and I again think Guy Newland's analogy really does kind of get at that, because again, the information that you're getting in either of those views don't contradict each other. They actually complement each other, and there's still a validity to both sides, because we have to understand. If we use karma as an example, karma is said to be one of the Buddha's most important teachings. And last week, I even talked about how karma informs what we are perceiving, how we are knowing our world. Remember the glass of water that humans see, and the glass of pus and blood that hungry ghosts see, and the glass of ambrosia or nectar that the gods see. All three of those are valid for those three beings. They are their conventional awareness of that glass of fluid. So karma is something that we never want to abandon. We want to uphold it within the understanding of conventional reality to get at how do things actually come into existence. Karma as a law of cause and effect is never refuted in terms of, yes, it's merely imputed causes and merely imputed effects. They don't have any substantial or real existence, but they exist nonetheless. They can be designated as a non-virtuous karma that gives rise to a suffering result, and so on. That arises, that non-virtuous karma, from a non-virtuous state of mind, an unwholesome state of mind, such as anger, what have you. All of these things exist merely imputed, but they exist. Conventional truth, conventionalities need to be upheld. But we have to get at their actual way of existing, because again, it's our confusion about that that's at the root of our problems. That's why we need channel B radio, right? All emptiness all the time, because we have to tune into that to really understand, as Guy Newland said, how things on channel A actually exist, that they don't exist in the way they appear, but they still have a validity within the context of dependent arising, still, giving rise to various experiences and things within our conventional awareness. So a nice analogy, I think, for showing how the two truths complement each other. Any questions on that or on the two truths before we move on to the rest of what I want to cover tonight? No? Some things to think about, perhaps? I mean, I do have to admit that this is a nice little book. It gets tough in a couple of places because, again, it's an introduction to one of the most profound explorations of emptiness that Tsongkhapa ever did, which is in the special insight section of the great treatise, the Lamrim Chenmo. But nonetheless, there's a lot of really nice stuff in this that is very approachable. In fact, he composed it, I think, as an introduction to that topic before His Holiness taught on the great treatise back in 2008, which I had the opportunity to go to. Did you go, Judith? I don't remember. Yeah, to Lehigh, Pennsylvania, Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania for teachings with His Holiness. There were a number of us who went from the center here. Yeah, I think Bill has a question. We need the microphone for Bill. Oh, name of the author, Guy Newland. Newland, Newland. And there are some, his name and the book title is in the slides, I believe. Let me actually pull up the slides if there are no other comments. Oops, I've got it. I forgot to pull up that as well. Let me just go back one thing here and I'll pull up my slides. And last call for any questions on that before we go on. Anyone? Okay. And let's go ahead and do a few slides. Again, I had already prepared a few slides for what I already talked about. That's okay. We'll just go through them rather quickly. Again, I wanted to start with this review of the two truths tonight. Then we're going to go on in the rest of tonight and talk a little bit more about the process of gaining realization of emptiness and what's entailed in that, because that's the whole gist of this course, is to help you on that path of realizing emptiness. We touched on a little bit already. Deepening love and compassion with insight. This is based on something that is in His Holiness's books, in that final sections of his book. And it's based on Chandrakirti's Praise to Great Compassion at the beginning of his supplement to the Middle Way, a really amazing text that's meant to be kind of an exploration of Nagarjuna's fundamental wisdom. Then number 4, ways to work with the teachings in this module. Kind of some advice that I think is hopefully useful for you as you go forward from this module. And this is what we looked at last week, how we can say, and these are not meant to be, again, debate-proof definitions. This is simply a description. Conventional truth generally referring to how all conventional phenomena arise in dependence on various factors, the most subtle being their dependence upon mere imputation. Because once more, remember that even emptiness, although emptiness is not a conventional truth, it's only an ultimate truth, it too is merely imputed. It has no inherent existence, because it's referring to the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena. It too is merely imputed, merely designated. Ultimate truth, on the other hand, refers to the emptiness of conventional truths. That is how they lack any independent, inherent, or intrinsic existence. So again, the thing I didn't talk about last week that I began with tonight was how this little description doesn't get into how are they established. They're established in their own mode of what is validly known. Valid conventional awarenesses, valid cognition of conventionalities, and then the valid cognition of ultimate truth, of emptiness. So then I went through the 2 radio stations example. Again, this is the book, Introduction to Emptiness, will get you there. It's got a longer subtitle, but Guy Newland, and that's what I read from. So let's go ahead and carry on with what else we want to look at tonight, the process of gaining realization of emptiness. So I want to start with talking about the 3 types of wisdom. I don't think I've touched on this yet in this module, though it's possible I did. I know I talked about it in the Thursday night class last week, I think, or the week before. It was brought into the discussion of the Buddha nature and what have you. We have 3 different kind of levels of wisdom, and these are somewhat of a hierarchy, and each depends upon the previous one. The very first one, the wisdom arisen from hearing or study, and you may have run across these three wisdoms previously, but I really want to talk about them in the light of the teachings on emptiness and how we work with emptiness to gain realizations. So, hearing or study is referring to how that information comes in initially. And for many of you, perhaps, or some of you at least, this was maybe your initial exposure to emptiness, or maybe you had previous exposure through some of the other Discovering Buddhism modules, such as Module 3 that talks about, the overview of the path. But you've had some introduction to emptiness somewhere along the line that has given you the stuff from which to begin to investigate this topic. When we say the wisdom arisen from hearing, we're not necessarily talking about only what you're doing right now of listening to a teacher give words about emptiness and how to analyze and blah, 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 blah. We're also talking about any way that we bring other information in through our reading, through our continuing to study and look at various texts. And while I'm talking about this subject, I do want to emphasize that it's important to have both of those, to listen to other teachers on emptiness, especially people who have realized emptiness. I mean, I sit up here and talk about emptiness, go blah, 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 but I don't have any realization of emptiness at the level that would qualify me to really speak to what that experience is like. Whereas if you go to see, when Lama Zopa Rinpoche was here with us, or His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is still teaching online, you can see many of his teachings, or any of these quite amazing teachers they say they don't have any great experience of it. They're very humble in their qualities, but I trust that they do have some greater awareness of emptiness, certainly than what I have. Go to these teachings, listen to these teachers, hear them expound upon emptiness, hear what they have to say, their approaches to it. It's invaluable. The times that I would spend with Lama Zopa Rinpoche at what were called the Light of the Path retreats, there were 5 or 6 of them, I can't remember how many, out in North Carolina from 2009 through 2017. They weren't every year, but they were a number of years in there. And when he would start talking about emptiness, it would be just like this wild, interesting kind of journey that you'd be going on about where Rinpoche is going to take you around his understanding of it and what he's going to talk about. And it was always just really, I mean, for me at least, quite involving. Other times when he'd teach, maybe I wasn't quite as engaged, but when he would start to talk about emptiness, he says, I'm going to talk about emptiness tonight. And I'd be like, oh, good. Wouldn't have a problem staying awake till like 2 a.m. But, I think it's really invaluable to hear other people teach on emptiness once more, especially people who have had much greater experience and realization than what I possess. And I'm giving you the bare bones and trying to explain things that you've already read in His Holiness's book and so on. But I don't have the level of awareness and knowledge that they possess. And then again, to read. There are so many resources now in English that we can depend upon as reliable guides. Again, I've put a few of them in your book list for this course that are, again, a bit beyond where you're at now, perhaps. Insight into Emptiness by Khensur Jampa Tekchuk, that I quoted from a little bit here and there. It's a wonderful book and really is quite detailed on a lot of different aspects around emptiness. Emptiness Yoga, I think I quoted from here and there. It's another book, older book by Jeffrey Hopkins. It's got a lot of philosophical stuff in it, but it's also quite tasty in the first part of it. So, there's a lot of teachers out there who've written pretty amazing books that help you to explore this topic. If you ever need any more resources, can let me know and I'll be happy to go through all of my books and share whatever. And remember, even this series that's been coming out, I think there's only one more volume left of the Library of Wisdom and Compassion or something that His Holiness and Venerable Children have been doing. There are 3 volumes on emptiness. All 3 are published now, and they're really quite amazing. I haven't read them all. I've read little bits of them because I haven't had time to sit down and read them from cover to cover yet. But there are, again, so many resources out there. Lamrim Chenmo. And of course, if you continue your study here through the after basic program, we'll see. Maybe at some point they'll actually institute the program that's meant to be a bit of a bridge that I was piloting last few years. That's called, right now it's called exploring Buddhism, but it's kind of helping you to go a little bit deeper into some of these topics before you go on to the basic program. But if you go to the basic program, there's a wonderful text that you can study on emptiness in terms of the Heart Sutra, a very short course. There's also a course, Emptiness, covered in the Stages of the Path teachings there. I'm just kind of whetting your appetite. There are many, many more ways that you can explore emptiness. This should be like, this course in essence is like putting your toe in the water, okay? Maybe a little more than a toe, but nonetheless, you're just really sampling it, just getting an idea of it. It's important that that first wisdom continues to be generated. We have to keep bringing in new information, keep bringing in what will help us to become clearer and clearer in our view of emptiness. As we can see, it's a little fuzzy at times. We have to kind of get, well, what is the object we're negating? And what is it that emptiness is really doing by refuting that? How are things actually existing? It all is something we have to keep formulating through introducing more and more information. The second type of wisdom is that which arises through, different words are used here, contemplation, reflection, thinking. That's what it essentially is. It means you have to think about these teachings. Don't let them become merely intellectual. And for most people who are engaging in meditation right now, all of you in Discovering Buddhism, perhaps, even myself, our meditation is still in this category of the wisdom arising from reflection, thinking, because we don't yet have the third category of wisdom arising from meditation, because we don't yet have a deep enough meditative focus to be able to engage in that. So for most of us, when we sit down to meditate and we do our analytical meditation, remember we talked about meditation earlier in this module, the main gist of calm abiding is to get that stabilized mind, that mind that isn't going to be distracted away from whatever it is that we're focusing on. And then you introduce an analytical topic. And through the force of your having stabilized the mind, you can stay on the analysis much more with greater focus, with greater intensity. And you can get to the level of realizing emptiness to some degree. And then you can go back to the stabilizing and kind of keep doing this back and forth to when the stabilizing on emptiness, when you get to some meaning of it, when it starts to wane, then you go back to the analysis and you bring it back to mind more vividly, and then you stabilize on that again. This is all a process. This is all to get us there, these stepping stones. But my point is that everything that we're doing, and I'm making an assumption, some of you may be, Buddhas for all I know, you may have realized emptiness eons ago. But for most of us, this is what we're engaged in terms of this wisdom arising from reflection, is when we sit on our cushion and we put the meditation in front of us, or we recall it from our memory, and we think, okay, now I'm going to go searching for the inherently existent I. I have to bring it to mind, identify it, and so on, all the steps of the 4-point analysis. And when we get to that, we focus on that, and then we try to reinvigorate it when it wanes, and you go back and forth, and you just keep working with it, refining your view of emptiness. That's really an important and part of this process, not to just let it be, oh, I can talk about emptiness forever. What is it like for you to actually come to some understanding of it? Albeit still conceptual, albeit still a bit removed from the final view. But we're in the right direction. We're moving there. We're analyzing. We're coming to remove our mistaken ideas about it. His Holiness, I didn't touch on this. He had one section after the 4-point analysis where he talked about, testing your realization. Because in that analysis, we worked with the I, right? The person who we identify with as me, as this I. And he says, if you have correctly analyzed it and gotten to a place where you see it doesn't exist, that inherently existent I, that real I, well, then you should turn your attention to something like your arm. And then does your arm also have that same lack of inherent existence? And that's an important step, because remember, there is a distinguishing between the selflessness or emptiness of the person and the selflessness or emptiness of phenomena, which is everything other than the person. And if you have the right object of negation, and if you are doing it correctly through your analysis, you will look at the arm and analyze in the same way, and you get to the same place. You go, wow, there's no real arm here. This real arm that appears to have armness all over it has no real arm. There's no real arm there. That's the test. But we, again, keep working with that. So that's the second type of wisdom, and invaluable to getting you to the third level. The third level, I'll put those back on the screen so you have them all in front of you. The third level is actually called the wisdom, which I should say arisen from meditation. Sorry, I'll make that correction for the final slides. The wisdom arisen from meditation. This is based on a union of calm abiding and special insight. Even His Holiness mentions that in his book. Until you get to that place where you have fully qualified calm abiding or something very close to it, one of those higher mental abidings. Remember, there were like 9 steps to get there. Something in like the 9th level would qualify generally. But you have to unite it with special insight, which is your analytical mind. You know, when you have both of those, I think I may have mentioned this analogy. They say it's like, yeah, maybe I didn't. I don't know. It's a wonderful analogy. I shouldn't have left it out. These two, calm abiding and special insight, are like if you were in a very dark cave trying to examine paintings that were on the wall through the use of a candle flame, right? So say you had just the candle flame, it didn't have a covering over it or something, and it was a bit drafty in the cave. Well, then the flickering of the candlelight is not going to allow you to be able to see what's on the wall for any great period of time, right? That's like our mind being distracted, and developing calm abiding is like having the candle flame very steady so that the light is always there. What's going to appear to that then can be known much greater because you're not distracted. You're not seeing it at times and not seeing it at other times. You're going to be able to actually hold the mind there. Whereas the kind of brilliance of the light, the intensity of the light, its ability to discern everything that is on the wall, in essence, is the special insight. You know, so we need both the bright light but the steady flame, right? If you don't have both together, regardless of how bright the light might be, if it's still flickering and not allowing you to actually get a good look at what's on the wall, well, then you're never going to have that insight. So these two it's a wonderful example for how they work together. You have to have it stable, but then you also have it very bright and intense. You know, we need that bright wisdom. The wisdom arisen from meditation is when you have both of those lined up, when you have the mind being quite stable, able to remain on the object, and you're investigating quite sharply. You get to a place where you can actually discern emptiness quite correctly. You initially have that union of calm abiding and special insight, those two united, observing emptiness conceptually, which is what you've been doing so far anyway. You're always in that conceptual mind until further down the road, again, you get to that non-conceptual awareness I mentioned earlier. So again, this is the process. And again, we could say that the wisdom arisen from meditation, it includes the direct realization of emptiness, because that will also be a union of calm abiding and special insight, but it will be more profound in terms of it becoming what we call a yogic direct valid cognition, or yogic direct cognizer. It's through the force of yogic practice of the mind being focused, and it is a direct cognition, a direct realization, meaning, I think I used this phrase last week or the week before, it's like emptiness, I'm sorry, like fresh water poured into water. Emptiness is like the fresh water that we normally are observing as another object, and then we have the fresh water of our minds, which is the observer. Those two fresh waters kind of meld together and become a single essence. This is what happens at that point when you get to a direct realization of emptiness. So everything is important. All of what we're doing in those 3 levels of wisdom, initially hearing teachings, studying, reading, putting on the YouTube, you know, to hear His Holiness teach on the middle way. All of these various things are so important. They bring in the information for you to work with. They help correct errors that you have through your listening, perhaps, or not, you know, getting things correctly the first time or second time, whatever. Then you have to think about it to get your own kind of digestion of this material. You have to really contemplate on these teachings. Through the force of that contemplation and your development of calm abiding, together with your special insight into this truth of emptiness, will eventually become a conceptual awareness of that, which then eventually falls away and you have that direct realization. The direct realization, I mean, they say this experience is like nothing else that you've ever had. I mean, you'll know it by your coming out of it because the experience of having been in there, again, there's no real subjective awareness. And when you come out and the way that you observe things is very, very different. I mentioned this previously. This is like the person who is lucidly dreaming all the time. They know that the dream objects aren't real, even though they appear. It's the same with regard to these beings, these Arya beings, these superior beings who've had that direct realization. But they got there through the three wisdoms. That's the only way to get there. You can't get there. I mean, I appreciate many of these traditions talking about like kind of a spontaneous realization of emptiness. I mean, I'd say the Tibetan Buddhist explanation for that is, well, you must have done the work in another lifetime where it's kind of right below the surface and you're able to conjure it up because you realize it in a prior lifetime at a very deep level, or at least you've done some preliminary work. But it makes some sense. You know, how does someone stumble upon emptiness? You have to find something that gets you there. I'm not in any way trying to denigrate any other traditions because some of them also talk about different ways of approaching it, like in some of the Zen traditions where they work with koans and what have you, as kind of another route to get to it. But you have to do something to kind of get to it. You don't just, I don't think it's possible to just kind of be walking down the street and suddenly, wham, you're hit by a direct realization of emptiness without anything. You know? You have to have something that plays into your ability to cultivate that state of mind. So in our tradition, we do emphasize a lot of the conceptual thinking. Abandoning conceptuality is a part of the process, though. Conceptuality does have its faults. Again, some of this was talked about way back in module one, but you know, you have kind of what is appearing to conceptuality is not the real object. It's always an idea of the object, what we call a kind of generic image or a meaning generality, different translations of this. This kind of appears to the mind of conceptuality, and it's not the real object. Look, if I ask all of you to think about your mother of this life, bring that awareness to your mind. You know, you can think about her visual form. You could think even about, you know, the sound of her voice or the, you know, smell of the perfume she would use or whatever case might be. You can think about different aspects, but you can conjure that up. That's not your real mother, right? That's only an image of your mother. It's based on your mother, who is this being who knew through your senses and kind of being able to observe your mother and listen to her voice and what have you. But what is appearing to your conceptual mind is not your real mother, right? So conceptuality does have its limits. And conceptuality isn't always pointing to the truth because it's through conceptuality that we're actually in trouble because we're conceiving of inherent existence with regard to everything and it doesn't even exist. So conceptuality is the problem, but conceptuality is also the framework to get us to overcome the problem. You know, by being able to analyze and you know find out, well, how do things actually exist? Where is my conceptuality going astray? Where am I misconceiving things? And to be able to undo that. But I just wanted to spend a little time tonight in that kind of second topic, talking about, you know, how do we go about achieving a realization? You know, a lot of hard work. I remember I had the honor of being in the audience with, well, not personal audience, in a huge audience with His Holiness in 1997 in Los Angeles, I think UCLA auditorium or something. He was teaching, His Holiness was teaching on Nagarjuna's Precious Garland. And it was interesting when they were taking questions, as His Holiness often does. You know, I might finish a teaching a little early, and he says, what questions have come in from the audience? And Thupten Jinpa, his translator, held up this question. He said, Your Holiness, what is the quickest, easiest path to enlightenment? And of course, everyone chuckled in the crowd. It was kind of like, oh, we know that question. What's the quickest, easiest way to kind of get yourself enlightened? His Holiness, at first he started talking in Tibetan and kind of giving an answer to Thupten Jinpa, and then suddenly he stopped and he started weeping. He was just like kind of bent over and weeping. And when he sort of came out of that, and at that point, it was kind of interesting in this huge auditorium, I don't know how many people, You could literally hear a pin drop. I mean, there was absolute quiet, eyes just all glued on His Holiness. He came out of that and he said in English, he says, that reminded me of a story of Milarepa. He says, when Milarepa was approaching the end of his life, and he had told some of his closest disciples that they should show up the next morning for a special teaching. And of course, they're all thinking, wow, he's going to really give us the real stuff. He's going to give us the things that he never did throughout the whole time, so that we'll get the way out, again, in a kind of quick, easy way, whatever, something that would be some magical teaching. And they show up the next morning, and all Milarepa does is he stands up, he turns around, and he lifts up his robe to show his backside that is completely calloused from all of his sitting. So the message, of course, is don't think quick and easy, as His Holiness was waving at the audience. Don't think quick and easy. Think long term. Think that this does take a lot of work. It does take a lot of sitting. You're going to get calluses on your rear end, by sitting continually and having to do all the hard work that gets you there. But there's no easy way. Don't look for the easy way. So again, that's the approach we have in Tibetan Buddhism that His Holiness really emphasizes. Tantra, which is the next module, I might just give a little plug for that because it's an important aspect of Tibetan Buddhism in particular. Though I don't think it's absolutely exclusive to Tibetan Buddhism. There is one branch of Japanese Buddhism that does work with Tantra, but Tantra is said to be the quick path. But you have to have, as you're going to hear if you take that module, a very, very strong mind. A mind that has this, what we call unbearable compassion, that is so driven to become enlightened as quickly as possible because it's unbearable that your kind mother sentient beings continue to suffer for one more second because you're not yet a Buddha. It's not about yourself and getting yourself out of here. It's not quickest, easiest for me. It's quickest, easiest for them. It's the way to get out even more quickly so that I'm in a position to better aid those beings. It takes an incredible amount of effort and energy to practice it well. But nonetheless, it is said that if you do have all the proper conditions, you can become enlightened very, very quickly in just one small period of this human life. So again, it's not to say that we shouldn't seek those things, but seek them for the right reason. Seek them because you can't stand the fact that you can't help others yet because you're not enlightened. I mean, at least not help others to the degree that you'd like to. We can help others, sure. I mean, we can, go to the interfaith shelter and provide food for people who are unhoused. We can, do all these various things that will help us to alleviate some small portion of suffering going on in our world. And we can even teach the Dharma to others. We can share the Dharma with others and help them to have some, ability to understand how to change the situation more successfully. But we still don't know those beings' minds perfectly. We still are not capable of doing everything that could help them. Until you become a Buddha, you don't have that ability. So anyway, to dial this back to what we're talking about, this process of developing these wisdoms and eventually achieving a realization of emptiness is a long, arduous one. But don't give up and don't think that it's impossible because it's totally possible. Just have to put the right energy into it. Using Milarepa as an example, Milarepa was, if you don't know his whole story, he was a pretty bad dude for a while. Did a lot of horrible things that resulted in the deaths of many people. And he turned his life around. He met Marpa, and his guru, Marpa, helped to remove a lot of obstacles. He was able to achieve realizations of emptiness as well as full enlightenment in that one lifetime. So we have these examples. Lama Tsongkhapa is also another amazing example of someone who was able to do all of that with a single lifetime. So don't think that it's impossible, but yet acknowledge that it does take some time. Let's take just a little break before we do our remaining kind of bits. I don't have too much more to talk about, but we'll have an opportunity for some questions as well. So let's say here it's about 8:07. I'm guessing it'll be 8:08 by the time I talk. So we'll do to about 8:13, 5 minutes just to get up and stretch and take a little break. All right, so I will see you shortly. So let's go ahead and do the next topic. And just two more things I wanted to talk about tonight. This next one will take a little more time, perhaps. Deepening love and compassion with insight. If you've read His Holiness's section on this, you'll know that he uses this, what are called the three types of compassion, which actually comes from, again, the introductory verses to Chandrakirti's text, which actually is the text that they study in the monasteries. It's called Supplement to the Middle Way, Madhyamakavatara. It's the main one that's used. They generally don't study Nagarjuna's text as much as Chandrakirti's kind of commentary on it, though it's not strictly a commentary, it's kind of a supplement. Gives you all these additional topics. It's a pretty amazing text. His Holiness, in that section, page 201, he says, even though it is necessary in the beginning to have a strong will in order to develop love and compassion, will is not sufficient to develop these altruistic attitudes limitlessly. It is important to join the practice of love and compassion with the practice of insight. Even if you seek to help someone out of concern without insight, you cannot be very clear about what benefit will come of your efforts. And that we kind of have to, I mean, it was interesting. I've heard this phrase from Pema Chodron. She said that her teacher, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, used to call it idiot compassion, where we just do things out of a compassionate motivation, but we're doing it with kind of a lack of awareness and not being clued into exactly what we need to do. Certainly, idiot compassion at the most extreme level could actually cause suffering to beings, right? Because you're not, even though you're intending to do something that will remove suffering, because you don't have the knowledge or wisdom, you could actually be harming other beings. So we have to be kind of uniting what we're engaging in terms of the path of love and compassion, that other wing that is so important to pay attention to, that again is rooted in our conventional truths, with the wing of wisdom, with some deeper understanding. And these three types of compassion give us a really important way of approaching compassion at these three levels that can all have validity and can strengthen our compassion as we go through them. In the text that we studied in Italy as Chandrakirti's text, this is how they were translated in English. As the first one was compassion observing sentient beings, which is what we normally talk about as compassion, right? We understand sentient beings and their situation, and we'll go into that shortly. And we generate compassion because we see that they're suffering. The second one is compassion observing phenomena, which is shorthand for impermanent phenomena, meaning seeing the qualification of things having both gross and subtle impermanence. And so we'll go into that in a bit more detail. That's kind of getting us closer to emptiness. Remember, the teachings on impermanence don't necessarily equate to the teachings on emptiness, but they can be a good stepping stone, to help us to see that things are not exist or don't exist in the way that they appear. Everything seems to be somewhat unchanging, but yet things have a changing nature to them, all the things that arise from causes and conditions. The third one, compassion observing the unapprehendable. Well, what is unapprehendable? Inherent existence. So again, we're looking at the beings who lack any inherent existence, who are nonetheless holding to that inherent existence. We'll get to that when we, kind of arrive at that third level. But this is the whole point of kind of getting to where we have the deepest understanding of how sentient beings are suffering, through seeing how they are grasping at something that is not in truth. It's unapprehendable. It cannot be actually known. I'm going to share the verses with you. For the first one, there's a single verse, the third verse of the very first chapter. Again, this is part of Chandrakirti's homage to great compassion. And so he talks about these three as different ways of generating compassion. And then the second and the third are actually both embedded in the next two lines of the fourth verse, the first two lines of the fourth verse. So here we have a translation of that. It's a little different than the one in His Holiness's book. Homage to that compassion for migrators who are powerless, like a bucket traveling in a well, through initially adhering to a self, an I, and then generating attachment for things. This is mine. We talked a little bit about this. This is that ignorance again that is clinging to the strong sense of an I, and even that I as a possessor who thinks this is mine, my body, my, car, my wife, my whatever, all the various things that people possess. So again, this is how we could describe that. Compassion observing sentient beings is the great compassion. And great compassion is distinguished from simply compassion in that it's the wish to actually be the agent of removing suffering. It's not just the wish that sentient beings not suffer. It's that thought, and may I be, do whatever it takes to remove the suffering of others. So this is the great compassion for all sentient beings who are wandering powerlessly in samsara, like a bucket traveling in a well. In the book, it points out 6 kind of similarities between the bucket traveling in the well and what's happening with sentient beings. Again, I can direct you to the part of the book where that is set out, but I'm going to just share them from notes that I have. There's one that has slight differences, but very slight. The first one is this bucket, again, is tied by a rope to a wheel. And this is, I think they call this whole mechanism at the top a windlass. We're going to talk about that later. But the bucket itself is tied by a rope, right? Essentially, what this is referring to is that sentient beings are bound, they're tied by their past actions that are committed by the afflictive emotions, the 3 poisons, especially the ignorance that's at the root of all of that. Essentially, we're talking about them being tied up or bound by these factors that are keeping them in the bucket of, or I'm sorry, in the well of samsara. So sentient beings are the bucket in this analogy, and they're bound by their karma and delusions. Secondly, just as the turning of the wheel depends upon a person operating it, right? Again, if you have one of those old stone wells where there's a bucket going down, someone has to be at the top with the mechanism, taking the bucket up or down or whatever. So too does our wandering in psychic existence depend upon our consciousness. There's the agent of what creates the experiences all during the well is our consciousness, just as the operator, takes the bucket to the various levels or various parts of the well. Third, just as the bucket travels down to the bottom of the well and up to the top, so we travel among the various levels of psychic existence, being born over and over again as hell beings, hungry ghosts, animals, humans, demigods, gods. And we talked about the form and formless realms earlier on in this course, and we were talking about concentration. There are so many different existences, but they're all in the bucket, in the well, right? And the bucket goes from the top to the bottom, to the middle, to the bottom, to the top, to the middle, all over, kind of visiting all of these various stations of the well on the basis of the operator being our consciousness that creates the karma that causes you to be having these particular experiences. The fourth one is kind of an interesting one. Just as the bucket descends easily in the well, of course, due to the force of gravity, right? It doesn't take much effort to get the bucket to the bottom of the well. It'll go there almost immediately. And yet it's difficult to draw it upwards, even with hard work, of course, especially if it's full of water, which is what buckets do. They go down, they collect the water, and then you have to use all this effort to pull them up. But even without the water, it does still take more effort. You can just simply let it go, and it goes right to the bottom. And then you get it back to the top, you have to use more effort. Well, this is comparable to the amount of effort it takes to fall into the lower realms versus the great effort it takes to end up in the upper realms. Doesn't take any effort at all to fall into the lower realms. All we have to do is just follow our instincts and behave in whatever way we want to, have attachment for this and hatred for that and blah, 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 blah. All the delusions take over. All of our karma gets generated. We engage in harmful actions to other beings and we fall to the lower realms like that. I mean, it doesn't take much effort. To fight those impulses, though, to actually do something that's opposed to them, takes a great amount of effort. Using this life even for just practicing good morality. Remember, that's the first of the 3 scopes of the Lam Rim. Practice some good morality, avoid negative karma, avoid the 10 non-virtues so you can get a good rebirth. Takes a lot of effort because we have a natural tendency, just like the bucket succumbing to gravity, to just fall right to the least common denominator, those actions that we're really quite acclimated to from beginningless time. Now, number 5 is where there's a little difference in just the explanation that's given in His Holiness and what I'm going to mention. But the idea here is that there's kind of this confusion of the order based on, again, what's called this windlass, which is sort of the mechanism by which it descends and ascends. Yeah, descends and ascends in the well. And the idea is that if I would imagine, I don't know for sure if in module 9 of Discovering Buddhism, you went through the teachings on the 12 links of dependent arising and the wheel of existence. If you didn't, essentially there are 12 factors that all play a role, according to one of the Buddha's sutras, in creating our continued rebirth in samsara. And they can be divided into 3 categories, which are the 3 categories of the first 2 truths. The sufferings that are the results of all of it, the karma that is the most direct cause of our sufferings, but then the delusions, the afflictions, which would include ignorance, that are the agents of creating that karma. So essentially, we have those 3 playing a role in terms of these 12 links that cause you to take rebirth again and again and again. It's a wonderful teaching if you've never had teachings on it. I think Geshe Sherip may have taught on it not too long ago, perhaps. I don't remember. I think he did. Yeah, Lewis agreeing with me. So the idea here is that it's hard to distinguish these 3 because they feed into each other. We have these suffering experiences and they're unpleasant, and then we generate a mind of anger, and then that causes us to create some negative karma on the basis of that. But then that ensues in some suffering, and sometimes the suffering immediately might create some karma. It becomes very hard to tell where one starts and the other one begins. I'm sorry, other one ends, sorry. Where one starts and the other one ends. So it becomes this sort of, if we think about a windlass, this mechanism that's kind of rotating. It's like, where's the beginning? Where's the end? It just keeps rotating. And so that's kind of the idea behind it, is that it's difficult to determine, how each of these 3 lead to each other. They get very convoluted, and it makes it quite impossible for us to, determine the order, to kind of be clear about all of it. Now, again, we can see from the tree of samsara that the real order is just like in the 12 links, because the very first of the 12 links is ignorance. The root is ignorance. That is the starting point. But it's quite confusing because we're caught up in this process. How do we even get to the ignorance when we're constantly involved in our other afflictions and in creating karma and experiencing the suffering of past karma and what have you? Anyway, that's what I can give you on this 5th similarity. The 6th similarity is what's happening to the bucket as it's going up and down. Buckets don't just stay generally in like one little column. They're getting battered against the wall of the well, right? This represents all the various sufferings that we have to experience. And of course, back in module 9, you looked at the 3 types of suffering. The first one is what we often call suffering, which is the more direct, grosser forms of suffering, manifest suffering, or some people call it the suffering of suffering. This is the in-your-face suffering, mentally or physically having to deal with what is unpleasant. But that's only one part of our suffering. Another way that we're being battered against the walls of the well is through even experiencing pleasurable things that don't lead to any real happiness. Right? That's the second type of suffering, called suffering of change, or the dukkha of change. This is where we have a deeper investigation to see that even what we experience is wonderful. I mean, look at how we spend these lifetimes developing such close relationships to people that we have to let go of at some point. Either they exit our life or we exit their life. There's what's that phrase? It'll end in tears. It always ends in tears. It never ends with everything being perfectly okay. We constantly having to separate from that to which we've gotten close. Constantly having to deal with even the most pleasurable things, never really continuing to give us the satisfaction that we seek. Everything is disappointing in some way. That's the nature of samsara. Again, the Dharma isn't samsara. The Dharma is the way out that gets you to what is more dependable, and you can actually rely upon the happiness of Dharma. But within samsara, nothing that you can find that's giving you any pleasure or joy or happiness really lasts, because that's the nature of those things. And then, of course, we have the third level of suffering, which is it's called uh, pervasive, conditioned, or compounded suffering. I think Rinpoche like compounded. This is just the overall state that we are in. This being under the control of our karma and delusions to continue to take another body, to have a new set of aggregates, as they're called: form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, consciousness. We don't always have an absolutely new consciousness, in that there is a thread of very subtle consciousness that goes through all of these lives. But the consciousness we have as a human being is very different from the consciousness of a dog, right? You know, at our dogs and what their minds are like and the things that we can infer. We don't know what a dog's mind is like because we don't have that ability to know their mind. But we can infer what their minds must be like, right? Or a cat or any animal. So you kind of go through the force of your karma and afflictions to continue to take a new rebirth, continue to take on new aggregates, life after life after life. That's the subtlest form of suffering that we can really contemplate. But that's another way that we're just kind of being battered against the walls of the well. This whole process of just continuing to experience the dissatisfaction of samsara, the prison of samsara, that in this analogy is the well. And of course, I guess, they don't talk about the well being removed. His Holiness does emphasize and maybe Jeffrey Hopkins is contributing to it, that you first need to see this first type of compassion for yourself. See how you're like a bucket in a well. See how you're going from life to life through the force of your own consciousness, your own behavior. See how, you've been in all these places and none of them have really been any satisfying. There's always some suffering, always some dissatisfaction. See it as it is. And then, of course, see it with regard to others. Because we are never about just stopping with compassion for ourselves. We then also generate compassion for other beings who we're seeing through that same lens. And just this first one is, of course, it's even different from the compassion that we have in other traditions, I think, other spiritual traditions, because a lot of what we see people observing and having compassion for in our world is mostly just the first type of the three sufferings, right? Nobody has compassion for the people who have lots and lots of temporal pleasures. The people who are sitting up in the beautiful homes and having, all these delightful things and being served by other people and never experiencing anything that looks like suffering. But they're suffering because they're dealing with the second type of suffering, right? So again, just this first compassion observing sentient beings, kind of qualified by the way Buddha sees their suffering, that is already really profound. Right? Let's go on to the second one. The second one, again, was called compassion observing phenomena, meaning impermanent phenomena, that things are constantly changing, all those things that arise from causes and conditions. Now, I've underlined the particular part of these two lines that pertains to this second type. The rest of it will refer to, or at least, the beginning of that second line will refer to the third one. Homage to that compassion for migrators seen as evanescent, like a moon in rippling water. Okay, so actually I realized I needed to not underline in rippling water in the last one, but that's coming later. So this is the example. Let's look at the little picture that I have there on the screen. This is, again, compassion observing phenomena refers to the great compassion that is viewing migrating beings as evanescent or momentarily disintegrating, like the reflection of a moon in water that is stirred by a breeze. Again, rippled water. So if I could only find like this little painting or something, but if you can imagine that, like it's a very clear night, but there's a full moon overhead, and you're kind of get a view of a lake. Say you're coming down from a mountain or something, and you get a view of this lake from a distance, and you see the moon there, and it's just kind of fluctuating in the water because the ripples of the water from the wind or whatever are causing it to just kind of move. Well, again, this is a grosser way of talking about impermanence, but everything that is produced from causes and conditions is like that all the time. Again, we can kind of highlight the gross impermanence that things actually go out of existence, many of them, and our grosser uh, level of being, where we talk about this life. This life will come to an end. This human existence that every one of us has will eventually cease. That's the gross impermanence. But then there's also the subtle impermanence, the fact that this body is changing all the time, my mind is changing all the time, even the thought of myself is changing all the time. I might have some ideas of it that are more lasting than others, but a continual process of things changing that is in their very nature. Now, why is this being highlighted as a particular form of compassion? Because in the first one, we're looking at sentient beings, and we're mostly seeing, again, those three levels of suffering, how sentient beings are suffering from all of that. In the second one, we're looking at one of the more specific ways that sentient beings suffer. They suffer because they don't have an awareness of impermanence. They don't even have, in our culture at least, as great of an awareness of their gross impermanence. Most beings, when you want to talk about death or dying, or help them to prepare for that part, they're like, why should I waste my time thinking about that? I'm just going to enjoy life. I don't want to think about death. How morbid. We have a culture that has very much sanitized death and tried to remove death. I mean, even when my parents were growing up, they would frequently have deaths in the home, where someone would be there. Nowadays, yeah, we've got hospice and all of that, so we try to accommodate people dying in the home. But for many people, it still seems like, I'd rather have that happen outside of my field of awareness. I don't want to really see death. I don't want to talk about death. So this is a painful thing for beings, right? Because they spend their whole life denying that reality. And they build, I mean, the analogy that's often used is like if you were to go to a hotel room and you were to just go out to IKEA and all these places and buy all this stuff to outfit your hotel room when you're only going to stay there for a short while, right? It seems absurd, right? If you think about the time and energy that you put into just making this one little place that you're going to stay in for some short period of time into the most beautiful, wonderful, delightful, pleasurable place. But this is what beings are doing with these lives they have. I mean, we all do it to some degree. Most of us have kind of started to let go of all of that stuff and not be so attached to temporary pleasures. But if we're still clinging to those things and, filling our whole hotel room with all sorts of beautiful things, when we're going to have to check out. When we check out, of course, is the big question. And that's one of the meditation points when you think about gross impermanence, is that there's uncertainty as to when you actually have to check out of the hotel. But what is the point in decorating the hotel like crazy when you know you're going to have to leave? And someone else is going to have to undecorate it. That's the other challenge, right? The people you leave behind are all going to have to come in and get rid of all your junk that you put in your hotel room. Kind of mixing all these metaphors. But anyway, the idea is that this gross impermanence is already such an amazing source of suffering for sentient beings. But subtle impermanence as well. The fact that everything is constantly changing. Look at the pain that people have around just seeing their bodies age, which is a product of all of that, right? That things happen, that hairs go gray and wrinkles happen on the face and da 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 da. All these things constantly changing because of the subtle change that's occurring under the surface. This is the nature of everything that is produced, none of it remaining for a moment, like the moon rippling on the water, never in one position all the time. So in this analogy, you're just really caught up in that idea of the moon and how that transitory nature, that evanescent nature, is the nature of sentient beings and the nature of everything that they experience. And yet, they're generally unaware of that. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the awareness of impermanence is a good stepping stone to get you to emptiness, but it's not identical. And we did talk previously in this course about how things changing would be impossible if things existed inherently. But if you get to the fact that things change, it doesn't necessarily lead you to think things don't exist inherently unless you do that additional investigation. And that's why we end up with the third type of compassion, that here again is observing the unapprehendable, that which, again, cannot be apprehended. Sentient beings who have inherent existence. This is again, I would change this. I'll do this in the after I put these slides together for to pass them on to Michael so he can get them posted out on the website with the course materials. How much of that compassion for migrators seen as empty of inherent existence, like a moon in water? Here, the water's not rippling. The idea behind this is that if you had a very clear night again, so you're not obscured with clouds, but it's calm. There's nothing happening on the water. And here too, you're kind of coming over that mountain ridge, and you might even mistake what you see in the water as the actual moon if you happen to catch a glimpse of it before you look up in the sky. Because the moon appearing in the water seems so real, the reflection of the moon. But it's not a real moon, right? That's the idea of kind of emptiness. This is compassion observing the unapprehendable, the great compassion viewing sentient beings as being empty of inherent existence, although they appear to exist inherently, like the reflection of the moon in calm, clear water. I think this is a painting too. I couldn't find an actual photograph that kind of did that, but where you see the moon being just as vivid and real as it appears in the sky, but it's only a reflection of the moon. It doesn't have any real moonness. That's again one of the analogies that we saw when we were looking at this idea of things being illusory, like a magician's illusion. We didn't have that one on the list. Oh yeah, we did. I think we had reflection, a reflection in a mirror. But the reflection of a moon in water is the same principle, right? So the idea here is that we need to go so far as to unite the deepest level of wisdom, not just the wisdom that knows impermanence, but the wisdom that knows emptiness and sees that sentient beings are appearing to inherently exist. They appear to themselves to inherently exist. And even again, all phenomena appearing to inherently exist to them. And because of their strong clinging to that, they're creating unbelievable suffering for themselves. And we can even say to some degree unnecessary suffering. It's all unnecessary suffering because if sentient beings only saw the truth of emptiness, it'd be over, right? They'd be able to exit stage left, have samsara gone, have the state of nirvana actualized, have Buddhahood actualized. Again, this is how we're kind of trying to, at the deepest level, really see sentient beings through the lens of the deepest error that they're making. Again, the Buddhists are making a lot of different errors. The impermanent, seeing everything as impermanent, or as permanent when it actually is impermanent, seeing things as having inherent existence when they lack that. These are two of the big ones. We make a lot of errors. And even that second form of dukkha or suffering, we often cling to pleasure as if it's real, as if it has some lasting energy. And it's actually in the nature of dukkha, of dissatisfaction. So again, the Buddha's job was to point out to us all these mistakes that we make. So here we're uniting our compassion, observing again first ourselves through the lens of these three, and then of course sentient beings, other sentient beings, and coming to see them through that lens of compassion. I like this one quote that is kind of similar to this when we get to that third level of kind of observing sentient beings qualified by their emptiness. And that's a quote from Kunu Lama Rinpoche. Some of you may have heard of this great Lama. He was one of His Holiness's instructors. He actually gave him the transmission and the teachings on Shantideva's texts, which you'll all be going into, or some people were going into in the new year with Dr. Ross again on Thursday nights. That text by Shantideva, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. Anyway, Kunu Lama Rinpoche was this amazing teacher, they say, who just had such incredible bodhicitta. He said, it's this simple. Everyone you meet has either realized ultimate reality, and if that's so, then they're an object of prostration, and I should just bow at their feet. Or secondly, they are still under the control of their ignorance, and therefore they are a suffering sentient being, and the only proper response is compassion. I mean, it's really that, and he says it's that simple. Everyone you meet, either they've realized emptiness and you should just prostrate before them because they have this incredible wisdom and knowledge. Of course, we don't know necessarily who has that. Or there's somebody who is still blinded by ignorance at some level, or dealing with some level of obscuration that is keeping them from being fully actualized. Most beings are completely blind to reality. That's kind of this third level where we really see that sentient beings, it's so sad. Even those who are up to the most despicable things in this world, we can even, hold them in that light of compassion because we see that they're under the control of this ignorance. They are not seeing themselves correctly. And they become an amazing object of compassion because they have that fault. And we can see it even more vividly because they wouldn't be engaging in all that negative behavior in the world if they had some wisdom, if they had insight. So this is a way to strengthen your compassion, is to really unite it with a view of sentient beings qualified in that way. Again, not just as suffering, which is what we tend to do in our compassion, and even the varieties of suffering that we look at, not just as impermanent and having to deal with that reality, but lacking inherent existence, empty of inherent existence. And in that way, we get at the deepest error that they are making. And we have the deepest compassion for them because that is what will drive us on our path, is to really want to give people that liberating wisdom. And the only way you're going to be able to give that liberating wisdom to others most perfectly is by becoming a Buddha for their sake. So it does feed into our bodhicitta. Compassion, its companion is love. And we did talk a little bit, His Holiness talked about love and compassion, frequently putting the two together. But compassion is a different force, right? When we are observing sentient beings suffering, it evokes a different response, a more visceral response. When we are thinking about their happiness, it might be even a little bit joyful because we're thinking about placing them in some state of joy and well-being. But when we're focusing on their suffering, it does have a different feeling that's evoked. So compassion is always said to be the root of our bodhicitta because it's the place we really do have to connect with the situation that beings are in. And this little schema of looking at these three types of compassion helps us to get there by seeing that it's not just beings having these various experiences, but also the causes of that. They're clinging to that which is impermanent as permanent, and they're clinging to that which is empty of inherent existence as though it had that. Let's talk a little bit to conclude about the ways to work with the teachings in this module. I'm going to share with you that I'm happy to share from, and I hope Thupten Pende, I'm sure he'd be happy that I'm sharing them. He's a wonderful teacher who's been around the lamas for a very long time and lives out in California. I received teachings from him on the Heart Sutra many, many years ago, but he says that there are four things that he would highlight as the ways that we can bring these teachings kind of to a greater depth. The first one you could even divide into two, I suppose. Think about emptiness and discuss it with your spiritual friends. Of course, thinking about emptiness, I already talked about to some degree earlier. That's that second wisdom, the wisdom that arises from reflecting and contemplating on emptiness. So, bring in the information through reading books and reading, or hearing teachings from His Holiness, what have you. But spend your time thinking about it. He even said, like, if you have like 10 minutes at the beginning of your day before you walk out the door, maybe just read one little passage in a book that you've been reading on emptiness and just sit and contemplate it. If you want to incorporate it into your daily meditation, that's fine. But even just to have that little bit of time where you're kind of thinking about it, to try to let it percolate. And I think this is an important part of our teachings, is that sometimes we don't give things so much time. I mean, this is one of the things that's like the curse and the blessing of having a center that has so many activities, is that you have so many things to go to and you get exposed to so many different teachings. And then you have guest teachers that come in and they give you even more stuff, and this text and that text and this subject and that subject. And you go like, oh, when do I even think about these things? When do I even process these things? And there's a real danger there because you might just get into a form of spiritual materialism and, thinking that it's just the job is just to collect an awareness of all these things, but never take it any further. No, I mean, at some point you need to really do a little bit more investigation, focus a little bit more. Module 8, some of that was discussed. Hopefully you had a chance to attend that, the one about establishing a daily practice. But then, of course, the second part of this, discuss it with spiritual friends. This is really important. Now, just spiritual friends, might have to define who those are. Those are people who are at your level of knowledge or right around that. Might be a little bit more. Certainly, if you have people that you can go to who are much more versed in emptiness and have greater experience in it, that's wonderful. That's, but it's really helpful just to have some discussion. As part of the basic program when it's taught here, I always want to make sure I incorporate discussion because in the monasteries, they use debate to kind of define and elaborate on their understanding. Because when you're debating with other people these topics, then you have to think really quickly and you have to kind of process it. But we don't do that much of debate. It's kind of hard in our Western culture, I think, to really incorporate the way that it's done in the Tibetan monasteries. But the idea is that if you at least discuss with people, well, then you start framing your understanding of emptiness in your own words. And you come to have other people hearing what you're saying and hopefully be open to hearing criticism. If people are hearing you say, well, I think emptiness means that, things don't have whatever. I mean, you come up with some little kind of thing that wasn't really what Don shared or what His Holiness has in the book. Well, then the other people hopefully have the permission to be able to say to you, well, no, that's not quite what I heard. Let me share what I heard and we'll discuss it. And you discuss it and you spend some time investigating with others. If you just come to a class, then you go home into your own silo and you kind of digest the material on your own, you will get something out of it. But how do you know if you're on track or not? If you start talking to each other, then you've got an opportunity to flesh out what your understanding is and to hear other people's understanding and to have your own measure. Well, is that right or is that wrong? If otherwise, you may not do that to yourself. You may just simply keep going, well, this is what he's saying. This is what it sounds like. This is what it's supposed to be. And emptiness is something you have to get pretty precise. You don't get it precise, it's not the way out, right? You're not going to get there. It's just not going to happen. So the second thing I had on the screen just a short while ago is meditate on the conclusion of your understanding as it evolves. Our understanding of emptiness is going to change over time. And for some of you who perhaps are just getting exposed to emptiness for the first time through this module, your conclusion of understanding, might be a little different than what it's going to be a year from now, or 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. But keep kind of meditating on it and investigating it to see if it holds water. We can't just take for granted that, oh, I did the meditation once and I got to emptiness and I understand everything that emptiness is all about. Well, chances are no. I'm not going to rule out the possibility that you have all these incredible imprints from another life and you're able to instantly realize emptiness. But for most of us, we really do need to have a continued investigation of this. Back in Module 8, there was wonderful advice given by Papanka Rinpoche, which said that one portion of your meditation every day should be on emptiness. I think the general advice is have one portion dealing with your spiritual friend and relying upon the guru, another portion dealing with emptiness, and the third one will be whatever other Lamrim topic that you're investigating in your Lamrim survey as you're going through the various topics of the Lamrim. Now, again, that might not mean for every one of you can do 3 sessions a day where you're actually engaging in a full practice and doing meditation as part of that. But within a single practice, you can find times to do that. Do a short reflection on emptiness as part of your practice, So again, I'm just pointing out the need for us to continue to develop and evolve our own understanding of emptiness over time and do that through our meditation, but also through discussion. Again, as we keep moving and others, perhaps our other peers, and we might even have other people that we get exposed to who have greater knowledge, keep using that as a platform to do deeper investigation into emptiness to help your own view of it to become more refined, closer to the actual view that we're trying to develop. I like what Thupten Pende says in regard to that. He says this action here that we're talking about is very important because we are continuously exposed to the propaganda of our ignorance. That ignorance is continually like giving us propaganda. We've been buying into that ignorance since beginningless time. It's a strong force. So the degree to which we can keep bringing our understanding to a more refined view and incorporating it into our life as much as possible. I'll talk about that in a moment. But that's a really important one. The third one contained two things as well: purification and accumulation of merit. In fact, when Lama Tsongkhapa was asking Manjushri for advice on how to attain realizations of the path, of course, one of them is meditate on the stages of the path. You can't deny that the meditation of these topics is important, especially emptiness. But he said, you also have to do a lot of purification of negativities and accumulation of merit. You combine those two because those are like tilling the soil, getting the soil ready for realizations to grow. Like if you have a bed of soil that you haven't tended to in a long time, there's lots of rocks and roots and things, weeds and whatever that have to be taken out. That's the purification. But the soil itself might need enrichment, because we've neglected it. And so we have to make sure that we put all those nutrients and everything into the soil so it can grow. That's like the merit. Those are important along the path. Lama Tsongkhapa himself had to engage in unbelievable amounts of purification and accumulation of merit to get to the correct view of emptiness. They say there's a rock, I've never seen this rock in Tibet, where Lama Tsongkhapa did mandala offerings, the full thing with the various levels and all these objects and everything. This rock, when he started doing these, because you have a place at the beginning where you go 3 times clockwise out and then counterclockwise in, this rock was rough. It's smooth now. I mean, it's completely smoothed out from him having made these millions of mandala offerings. And so if Lama Tsongkhapa had to do all that, who are we to question it? To say, oh, well, I don't need to accumulate merit. I don't need to purify my negativities. Those things are important. Even Lama Zopa Rinpoche, in one of his last times that I heard him speak, talked about how even to get calm abiding, I think I even mentioned this earlier in this course, you need a great accumulation of merit. A lot of people think, oh, I know all the instruction on getting this, and I'm just going to go off, find a good place, and have all the right conditions there, and it'll be fine. But if you haven't accumulated the merit, you could waste your time, spend months trying to focus the mind when you haven't generated the requisite merit. Now, how do you know what the requisite merit is? Just keep making merit. Just take for granted that you haven't made enough. This is true for all of our lives. We just keep purifying and accumulating merit. It's not like Western approaches to things where you go off to university to get a degree. You don't think you have to accumulate merit for that, right? You don't think in those terms. You think, oh, I have to have enough money to pay my tuition or get enough loans or whatever. But you don't think in those terms. We have to realign ourselves to think in terms of purification and accumulation of merit. The last one is to really understand that ethics is the foundation for concentration. And of course, concentration becomes the foundation for wisdom. If you don't uphold good ethical behavior, if you are engaging in the 10 non-virtues in serious ways that are going to cause your mind to not settle, well, then that's going to be the product. You won't be able to engage in good meditative focus. And therefore, your insight into emptiness will be lacking. And therefore, you won't get to the place you want to get to of having that wisdom arisen from meditation. So ethics is the foundation. Don't think that your behavior doesn't matter. It matters a great deal. I wanted to shorten just a little bit. I could talk more on that, but we're almost out of time. So let's go to the last screen that I have for you, I think. Those 4, again, I think people are clear about that, and kind of some suggestions on how to work with these teachings in your daily life is just don't, think that there's a lot of facets to it, the things I went through. I want to conclude with sharing some advice that Lama Zopa Rinpoche. This is the way I heard one of the teachings he gave on emptiness while we were at the Light of the Path one of the years, in that he was encouraging people to hold one of 3 views as you're going about your daily life. Whichever one comes more naturally to you. Of course, you could think about some of the other examples as being like a dream or whatever, but the first one is certainly if you've got a good understanding of emptiness from your having done repeated analysis, is thinking they're empty of existing from their own side, which again is completely contrary to how they appear. Things appear to exist from their own side, and you want to just hold the exact kind of antidotal view, homeopathic view, it's just directly denying what is appearing to you, thinking it doesn't exist from its own side. Everything lacks that. So that one's maybe a little harder for people if you don't have that repeated analysis. The second one is to really hold the dependent arising view, the subtlest one, that this is merely imputed by the mind. I remember Venerable Connie Miller when she was teaching, I think on this module here in Santa Fe, and she had suggested to people that they put little post-its on the things in their house that have the name of them as a reminder that when you looked at that, oh, this is just merely imputed as a cupboard, and this is just merely imputed as my stove, and this is just merely imputed as whatever, my coffee grinder or whatever the case might be. And we need to kind of think in those terms because once more, that gets us to this. The dependent reasoning of dependent arising gets you to emptiness by reflecting on the very subtle way that things actually do exist. That denies they're having any independent existence because they depend upon these various factors, especially imputation. And the third one was really interesting. He liked this word hallucination, like it's all hallucination, hallucination. I don't know if he ever had the experience of a hallucination, as many of the hippies who went to India and Nepal and met with the lamas all those years ago probably had experiences of LSD and all sorts of hallucinatory things, but we've had maybe things that are similar to that, even if you haven't consumed some of those substances. But a hallucination, once more, is something that appears contrary to how it exists. That it's something that doesn't have any reality at some level. Again, not complete reality absent, because there still is a hallucination, but the way it is appearing and the way that it exists are very different. But again, you could fill in there any of these other ones that we talked about, like a dream, like a mirage, like a reflection, like an echo. I mean, they use many of these different illusory references that kind of get at you to be around things in a little bit looser way. Now, again, I don't want to give this advice in a way that you think, oh, because it's like a dream, well, then I can do whatever I want because in my dreams I do whatever I want and there's no consequence. I don't kill people in my dreams in reality because they're just dream objects. That's not the import of this. It's like a dream, not a dream. Like an illusion, not an illusion. Even in that song, they say, oh, well, they actually do say that life is but a dream. Life isn't but a dream. Life is like a dream. Don't deny conventional reality again through any of those sorts of analogies that we've done, the similes of what things are like. All right, any final questions? I hope I've given you enough to work with on this module that you can think about things maybe a little differently. I don't know. Any questions from the... Oh, Bill has one here in the Gompa, but if anyone online has a question, please do put your little hand up on the icon thing and I will call on you. Yeah, Bill, please.
Is this working?
Yeah, I think so.
So my question is related to the ways to work with the teaching. Just number 4, recall that ethics is the foundation for concentration. I don't quite understand that unless concentration is like right thinking, or maybe you can expound.
Oh, no. By concentration, we mean being able to develop meditative stabilization, like we talked about earlier. So again, if you don't have a kind of foundation of good ethical behavior, the mind, they say, will never really settle. So say you're somebody who, like, is a butcher of animals during the day, well, and then you try to do your meditation at night. The way I hear it is that the Buddha says that lacking good ethical behavior during the day is going to mean that your ability to develop concentration is going to be lacking because your engagement in taking the lives of beings is acting as a disturbance to your mind that will not allow it to settle. We see this in grosser ways, right? If you just had an argument with a loved one earlier in the day and then you sit down to meditate, what happens to your mind, right? It, it's usually trying to like think about that person and maybe try to keep justifying why you said what you said and that you were right and they were wrong and da 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 about all the things that go on. maybe you've gotten over some of that, but you still might have some of that turbulence that happens when you get quite excited and having that type of discussion with somebody. We see that these things have an energetic influence on our minds. And in concentration, we're trying to calm and focus the mind. So whether it's energetic or whether it's discursive in terms of our thinking, or if it's just a karmic kind of thing that happens because engaging in those sorts of behaviors like being a butcher during the day just makes it very hard for the mind to settle at night. I don't know. Yeah. We've got a question online from Jai. Jai in South Australia.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. Look, I really appreciate this class, particularly today, has given me a feeling. I've been working on this topic for months and months, which I know is nothing in the long haul. But one of the things I keep running into is when I go to meditate, my I have a fear reaction. I don't exist, nothing exists. And
Mhm.
I know that that can be like as a result of that fear, can be a result of my karma. I know the general principle. If you're in a crisis, the thing to do is to keep doing whatever it is that got you into the crisis. And yeah, so, and karma. Anything else you want to tell me about how I manage this? Because it does interfere. It's very visceral, and it's like, I kind of feel like I'm in a science fiction movie, if you know what I'm saying.
Interesting.
That reality is not what I think it is. It's
Mhm.
very challenging for me.
I
So any
understand.
advice you can give me, I do appreciate. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Jai. I think one of the things to touch on this is that there are teachings, certainly, I didn't mention this as part of this module, and there's so many things on emptiness, it's hard to bring them all into this, but you're helping me to bring in this point. They actually do say that for some people, when they begin this process of investigating emptiness, it can bring up fear, and that actually can be a good thing, to not be totally averse to that fear, to think that that's kind of a negative sign. Rather, it can begin to point in the direction of uprooting this confidence that we've had in this wrong view of ourselves and of all phenomena around us and what have you. So it's not to say that fear in and of itself has a negative value when we're beginning to explore emptiness. It all depends. Certainly it can become, I suppose, a bit more of an irrational fear because once more things do still exist. It's just how they exist is not the way that we think they do.
Hmm.
So this gets to be a tricky thing to kind of work with, to keep dialing it back with the dependent arising teachings, where we make sure that we don't go to that nihilistic kind of point of view that can cause things to be fearful. The experience that you're talking about of kind of feeling like it's surreal or some sort of a science fiction movie or something, I don't necessarily see that again as faulty. It's just we have to begin to question the nature of things around us. We have to begin that process. And if it's what's coming up for us is some doubting that things exist in the way that they appear, that's a healthy thing in general. I guess where it could become a little more problematic is if it doesn't allow us to do the deeper investigation. Well, then how do I exist and how do things exist to kind of get to a more solid reliance upon the teachings on emptiness in the end, as
Yeah,
opposed to just simply, yeah, thinking things are a bit illusory and unusual and what have you. We still have to come to that conclusion that will help us to find both of these sides. Again, that things don't exist inherently, and yet they do have some subtle way of existing so that
yeah,
we can uphold reality, in quotes, within
yeah.
the sphere of that understanding of emptiness.
And intellectually,
So
I'm
I
fine.
don't know.
Intellectually, I'm fine.
Mhm.
Intellectually, I get what you're saying. This is an emotional trip that I get on.
I
And the other
understand.
part of that is feeling like I kind of recognize I'm not my body. Ooh, I'm not my
Mhm.
mind. And so it's like there's kind of almost a third person in here. Yeah.
And you have to negate the third person.
Well, hopefully, no. I have the, perhaps mistaken, but I have the sense that I'm on the right track with sort
Yeah,
of is, an ultimate me in a sense. I know that's
yeah.
badly worded, but that there's something going on that is not the body, is not the mind, but there is something else there.
Yeah. And I guess again, what we're getting at is the very subtle nature of what is still there. I mean, we never negate the mere I, or the merely imputed I.
Yeah,
We simply come to that very subtle understanding of how things rely in the end upon just mere designation, mere imputation, nothing more than that.
yeah,
I, I guess at some point, I mean, and I appreciate you really delineating it as not something intellectual, but rather a sort of fear that is coming emotionally.
yes,
And they often say that whenever we have something that comes up that becomes a bit of an obstacle, is maybe we investigate that. Okay, there's that fear. How does that fear exist? Does
mhm,
that fear exist in reality? Or can we see the very subtle way that we can't locate anything that absolutely is that fear? That fear is a dependent arising, dependent on various causes and conditions. It doesn't have any real nature from its own side, and so on. I don't know. That's one thing that they often say is kind of everything can become grist for the mill. Whatever it is that seems to be arising can
yeah,
also be analyzed because all phenomena lack inherent existence.
yeah,
So, and that may actually help because then we can see the lack of inherent existence of our fear. And then we realize there's no fear that's substantially real that we have to be invested in or being under the control of or what have you.
okay.
I don't know. That's one suggestion that I've
Yeah,
heard.
no, that
Um,
is helpful. And the other thing
mm,
is just recognizing that that fear is obviously an impediment that's coming up. That my
mhm.
my dear mind is so wanting so to cling to how it's always been, and it fears letting go of
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
it does. Yeah, yeah. But again, to see that there can be some healthiness to that fear too, because it
Sure.
means we could be touching on something that's really important to negate.
Yep.
That strong sense of I that you're talking about, Jai, that that doesn't want to let go. Well, that may be exactly what we need to work on to kind of loosen that up a bit.
Yes, sir.
So yeah, so fear can be kind of both things. Don't Yeah, my initial statement about it I think is important to recall. I just don't always see it as an impediment unless again it becomes something that does yeah kind of take over and cause us more suffering perhaps. It should feel very liberating in the end to realize
Yeah.
the emptiness of the I.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
thank you.
Appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Yeah, sorry
Blessings.
I've kept everybody here a bit late tonight, 10 minutes. If there are any final questions, maybe just one? I don't want to cut anybody off. None here, none online. Okay, then let's do our dedication. And I do hope that what has been shared here has been of use and that people are able to use these teachings in their life, as well as, of course, certainly in your practice, to be able to um, yeah, kind of take it to as far as you can go. And realizing emptiness, as we saw earlier tonight, is a process. And I wish you well with your study of that. Let's do these dedication prayers. And as we recite these, even recall the emptiness of the merits that we're dedicating, the emptiness of ourselves as the dedicator, the emptiness of the goal of enlightenment that we're dedicating for, as well as all the beings who we are dedicating for as well, who will benefit from these actions, all empty of inherent existence. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then the prayer for His Holiness. As we recite this, think about all of our other gurus, that they too will have good health, long lives, and all their wishes fulfilled. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Excuse me. And let's do the prayer for Lama Zopa Rinpoche's swift return. Fearless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wore the armor of patience that is never discouraged. incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. And let's dedicate for those beings we're holding in our hearts. Whoever it is whose situation moves us at this time, send this positive energy out to them. I think that it becomes the cause to help them to be free immediately from their suffering and to also find all the causes and conditions that will lead to their perfect happiness. And may this not be so, not just for these beings that we're thinking about right now, but for all beings, through what we've done here tonight. Thank you all for giving me the opportunity to share these teachings, and I will look forward to seeing you all again at some point. Have a very peaceful, safe, healthy holiday season. Happy New Year, and be well. Okay, thank you.